The sound of church bells filled the air. Across Nairobi, traffic lights blinked through a curtain of silence. Flags hung halfway trembling in the wind. That morning, Kenya stood still. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of heartbreak. The nation had just lost its conscience, the voice that once thundered for freedom, now gone forever. Raila Amolo Odinga, the father of Kenya's democracy, the rebel who became the nation's compass, was no more. For more than 4 decades, Odinga fought not for power, but for principle. He was detained, defamed, betrayed, yet he never surrendered the dream of a just Kenya. To millions, he was more than a politician. He was the bridge between hope and history, between a wounded past and the promise of a fair tomorrow. As the president's solemn words echoed across the nation, we have lost a beacon of courage, a tower of principle, and a father of our democracy. People wept in the streets. The news spread from Nairobi to Kisumu to the villages where his name had long been a prayer whispered under oppression. But beyond Kenya, something deeper stirred. From Ghana to Burkina Faso, from the Sahel to the Horn, Africans mourned not just a man, but a generation that believed democracy was worth dying for. And so tonight we ask, has Africa lost its last great reformer? Can the spirit of justice that Odinga lived for still survive in this new age of power and compromise? Or will his dream, like his voice, fade into the wind? If you still believe that truth outlives time, if you still believe that courage can guide a nation even after death, then stay with us. Because this story, the story of Raila Amolo Odinga, is not only Kenya's story, it is the story of Africa's soul. Please share this video if you believe his fight must never be forgotten. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. It began with a trembling voice on national television. Fellow citizens, the president said, standing behind a simple wooden podium draped in black. It is with deep sorrow that I inform the nation of the passing on of the Right Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga, our former Prime Minister, Kenya's foremost statesman, and one of Africa's greatest sons. For a moment there was silence. Not the kind that fills a room, but the kind that fills a country. In living rooms, in matatus, in crowded markets, the announcement froze time. Mothers stopped stirring their pots. Street vendors lowered their baskets. The nation, a tapestry of tribes, faiths, and generations, bowed its head as one. Odinga was not just a politician. He was history made flesh. For decades, his name had been synonymous with the word reform. He stood for the invisible, the prisoner without a lawyer, the farmer without a voice, the student with a dream. When others fought for votes, he fought for dignity. The president continued his tone heavy but resolute. He spoke of a patriot of uncommon courage, a Pan-Africanist and a unifier who sought peace above power. He praised Odinga's endurance through detention and persecution, years when he was locked behind cold bars for believing that Kenya deserved better. He reminded the nation that the democracy they now took for granted was watered by Odinga's own pain. Then came the words that sealed the moment in history, in honor of the Right Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga's extraordinary contribution to our nation. I have declared a 7-day period of national mourning. The national flag shall fly at half-mast across the Republic of Kenya and in all our missions abroad. Across the capital, the order took effect immediately. Flags outside parliament, schools, and embassies were lowered. Television channels paused entertainment. Radio hosts whispered condolences. In every major city, Nairobi, Kisumu, Mombasa, people lit candles and sang old freedom hymns that Odinga himself had once sung during his days in prison. The government announced that a state funeral would be held, the kind reserved for national heroes and heads of state. A joint committee was formed, co-chaired by Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua and Senator Oburu Odinga, his elder brother. The Prime Cabinet Secretary Musalia Mudavadi was tasked with leading a special delegation to India where Odinga's body was to be repatriated. Accompanying them were cabinet secretaries, party leaders, and family members, a rare coalition of allies and rivals united in grief. Even in death, Odinga had done what few living men could do: bring Kenya together. The images flooded screens. Ida Odinga, the widow, holding her children close at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. Crowds chanting "Baba Baba Father" as the casket arrived, draped in the national flag. At that moment, Kenya did not see political colors, only red, black, and green. As the president suspended all his public duties, the symbolism deepened. The entire government machinery slowed down, echoing the rhythm of mourning. Churches held vigils, imams recited prayers. School children stood in assembly yards, their tiny hands over their hearts. A sense of reflection rippled across the nation. Who are we without the man who taught us to question? What will become of the dream he carried for so long? For those who had lived through the dark years of dictatorship, the moment felt personal. Odinga had been there when journalists were jailed, when students disappeared, when votes were stolen. He had faced the state unarmed but unbroken. And now that same state, once his persecutor, was lowering its own flag in his honor. In one broadcast, an elderly woman from Kisumu said through tears, "He fought for us, even when we did not fight for him." Kenya was his only party. That was the essence of the moment, the merging of grief and gratitude. The event was not merely the death of a leader, but the affirmation of a life lived with purpose. The man who had once stood alone against power was now being mourned by the powerful. In death, Raila Amolo Odinga had finally united Kenya not through politics, but through memory. And as the sun set over Nairobi that day, the silence returned. It was not the silence of despair, but of reverence, the kind that comes when a nation remembers who it truly is. The day of return became a day of revelation. When the plane carrying Raila Amolo Odinga's body touched down at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, the air itself seemed to tremble. The engines roared into silence, and then came the sound of a nation exhaling, thousands of voices chanting one name: Baba Baba, Father of the Nation. The casket draped in the red, black, and green flag of Kenya descended slowly. Soldiers stood in two silent rows, rifles lowered, boots aligned on the tarmac. A brass band began to play I Mungu Nguvu Yetu, the national anthem, but halfway through the music broke. Even the trumpets wept. From every corner of the country, people had traveled for hours, some barefoot, some holding faded posters from the 1990s, when Odinga had led rallies calling for multi-party democracy. Many had never met him, but all felt as though they had lost a father. Mama Ida Odinga stepped forward, her black veil trembling in the wind. She reached out, placing her hand on the flag. For a brief moment, the crowd fell silent. Then, from behind the barricades, an elderly man cried out, "You kept your promise. Baba, you never left us." The crowd answered in one voice, a river of grief and pride flowing as one. At that moment, Kenya was not divided by party, religion, or tribe. Luo, Kikuyu, Kalenjin, Somali all stood shoulder to shoulder. In the streets of Nairobi and Kisumu, strangers embraced each other, some whispering prayers, others simply standing in awe of what Odinga had come to represent. A man who had spent his life in struggle had in death finally given the nation unity. Television networks across Africa broadcast the images, live the slow procession, the torchlight vigils, the faces of children wearing t-shirts that read, "Baba lives on." In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré ordered flags to fly at half-mast for 24 hours, calling Odinga a symbol of courage for a continent that refuses to kneel. In South Africa, Julius Malema posted, "The struggle did not end with his breath. It lives in us." Even global leaders responded. The United Nations Secretary General described Odinga as a champion of constitutional order and the African democratic spirit. From Washington, a spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State called him a bridge between generations of African reformers. The BBC headline read, "Kenya's conscience has fallen silent." Back home, candlelight filled the streets of Nairobi. Students marched to Uhuru Park carrying placards that read, "Freedom never dies, and we are the children of Odinga." Choirs gathered in open squares singing the same hymn he sang while imprisoned, "Freedom is not free." As night fell, thousands of mobile phone screens lit up the darkness. The president's speech was replayed again and again, his voice breaking at the words, "We have lost a beacon of courage, a tower of principle, and a father of our democracy." For once, even his fiercest critics praised him for his humility. The political class had laid down their swords. In the following days, parliamentary sessions began with moments of silence. Market vendors placed black ribbons on their stalls. And in homes across the country, people shared stories how Odinga had stood with the poor, how he had spoken when others feared, how he had refused to bow even when the price was prison. The climax came at the National Memorial Service held in Kasarani Stadium. Over 60,000 people gathered, waving flags and singing in unison. The atmosphere was both sacred and electric. When the casket entered, carried by 8 soldiers, the crowd erupted into a final chant, "Baba Handi Baba Ako Hapa, Father does not leave. Father is here," from the podium. The president wiped his tears before addressing the crowd. He looked across the sea of mourners, farmers, students, priests, soldiers, and said, "Let us come together, as he always asked us to do, not as rivals, but as brothers and sisters bound by a shared destiny." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was soft, steady, and endless, the sound of a nation making peace with itself. As the sun set that evening, its light spilling across the waving flags, a voice from the crowd whispered what millions felt: he fought for justice. Now we must fight for memory. And just like that, Raila Amolo Odinga, the prisoner who became the people's teacher, passed once more into legend. But this time, the whole of Africa was watching. In the days that followed, Kenya entered a kind of stillness, not imposed, but chosen. A silence of reflection, not fear. Shops remained open, but the air was different. Children in schoolyards spoke his name in history lessons. Street artists painted murals of Raila Odinga beside the words, "Truth is freedom." Everywhere, people seemed to walk slower, as if unwilling to disturb the sacred quiet he had left behind. But beneath that quiet was something powerful, a national reckoning. The parliament convened for a special session. Both ruling and opposition members stood together in the chamber for the first time in years. No shouting, no jeers, only silence and respect. The speaker's gavel struck once, and lawmakers rose to honor the man who had once stood in that same hall, demanding reforms that now defined Kenya's constitution. Majority Leader Kimani Ichung'wah spoke first. He taught us that opposition was not rebellion, it was responsibility. Then Junet Mohammed, the minority leader, followed. He was not just the leader of a party, he was the leader of an idea that the Kenyan dream belongs to all of us. It was the first bipartisan applause Kenya's parliament had heard in decades. Across the nation, universities announced new scholarships in Odinga's name. Civil society groups launched a freedom lecture series dedicated to the next generation of African reformers. The Odinga Memorial Foundation was proposed a nonpartisan institute to study governance, human rights, and Pan-African cooperation. For many young Kenyans, this moment was more than mourning, it was awakening. They filled social media with tributes, clips of his speeches and messages that read, "We are the generation he believed in. Let his unfinished work become our responsibility." At the same time, religious leaders, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, held an interfaith ceremony at Uhuru Gardens, the same ground where Odinga had once addressed rallies demanding constitutional change. The symbolism was profound faith replacing fear, unity triumphing over division. Internationally, the African Union announced it would posthumously award Odinga the Order of African Unity, its highest civilian honor. The East African community declared a day of remembrance for regional democracy. Even the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva observed a minute of silence. Yet amid all this honor, there was also unease, a quiet fear that Kenya might forget too soon. Older citizens remembered how easily history could be rewritten. They had seen heroes celebrated one year and erased the next. In talk shows and town halls, the question began to echo, who will carry his torch? Can anyone speak truth to power as he did and survive it? In the heart of Nairobi, a young student named Brian Awor stood before cameras holding a cardboard sign. "We cannot let this be the end of democracy. We must be the next Odingas." His message went viral, shared millions of times even beyond Africa. That single phrase, "We must be the next Odingas," became the unofficial slogan of a movement. Protests were replaced by public cleanups, community lectures, and volunteer campaigns. For a nation long divided by politics, this sudden wave of civic energy felt revolutionary. And while the government promised to build a national freedom square, in his honor the real monument had already been built not in stone, but in the conscience of the people. Raila Odinga's passing did not leave a void, it left a direction. For the first time in years, Kenyans began to talk not about politicians, but about purpose. It was as if, in dying, he had reminded the nation what living truly means. Not power, not wealth, but service. And that more than any flag or funeral was his greatest victory. The world did not just watch Kenya mourn, it paused with it. In Washington, the White House released a statement describing Raila Amolo Odinga as a steadfast believer in democracy, a reformer whose courage shaped not only Kenya, but the entire African continent. Flags at the Kenyan embassy flew at half-mast, and on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, members of the Congressional Black Caucus held a moment of silence. One congressman said, "When Africa produces men like Raila Odinga, the world must listen, for he reminded us that democracy is not a Western export, but a universal calling." Across the Atlantic, European leaders echoed similar words. The European Union called him the Mandela of Kenya, while the British Prime Minister, once a political adversary of Odinga during colonial reparations, debates admitted in Parliament history will remember him not for his defiance, but for his forgiveness. France's foreign ministry called his death a reminder that freedom is built, not given. At the United Nations, Odinga's portrait stood beside that of Kofi Annan, the Ghanaian diplomat, who once brokered Kenya's peace during its darkest political crisis. Delegates from over 60 countries stood as the African Union anthem played. The Secretary General's voice trembled. In an era when cynicism is fashionable, Raila Odinga proved that conviction is still possible. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré delivered a speech broadcast across the Sahel. He stood beneath the bright red flag of Burkina Faso, his voice calm but resolute. Odinga's struggle was not just for Kenya. It was for the soul of every African nation that refuses to bow to corruption, manipulation, or external control. He declared that Burkina Faso would build a public library named after Odinga, the House of Truth, dedicated to teaching African youth about ethics and leadership. In Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo called for a continental day of remembrance. In Nigeria, young activists lit candles at Freedom Park in Lagos, chanting Odinga's name beside murals of Fela Kuti and Thomas Sankara. And in South Africa, Julius Malema of the EFF told his supporters Raila was proof that revolution can wear a suit, that rebellion can be graceful. Western media, too, grappled with the loss. The New York Times called him the conscience of Africa's democracy. The Guardian described him as a man who never traded his principles for comfort. CNN ran a special titled "The Last of the Liberation Generation." But it was the tone of ordinary people that said the most. African Americans, Caribbean activists, and diaspora groups flooded social media with tributes. One post from Atlanta read, "He reminded us that Black freedom isn't geographic, it's global." Another from Jamaica said simply, "From Nairobi to Kingston, one struggle, one spirit." In classrooms and think tanks across the West, Odinga's legacy sparked a larger question. Why has Africa produced so many heroes of freedom, yet still struggles to be free? Political analysts drew parallels between Odinga's humility and the emerging confidence of a younger generation of leaders, men like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who now carry the torch of African sovereignty. Where Odinga fought through ballots and words, Traoré fights through policy and reform, both driven by the same hunger for dignity. For the West, Odinga's passing was more than the loss of an ally, it was a warning. That democracy, if not renewed through truth and courage, dies not in coups, but in comfort. And as one commentator on PBS put it that night, Raila Odinga's death closes a chapter in Africa's story, but the next one is already being written in places like Ouagadougou, Accra, and Nairobi. As the final notes of the national anthem faded over Nairobi dusk, wrapped the city in quiet gold. On the steps of Parliament, a young boy placed a single white rose beside the photograph of Raila Amolo Odinga. He could not have been more than 10 years old. But his gesture said everything: gratitude, loss, and hope, all in one trembling hand. Kenya was not the same country it had been a week before. Something invisible had shifted, a wound reopened, but also a heartbeat restored. For decades, Odinga had been the stubborn reminder that leadership is not about ruling, but about serving. And now his absence was teaching the same lesson in silence. Yet across Africa, a deeper question began to echo. Who will speak now when the giants are gone? From Ghana to South Africa, from Mali to Burkina Faso, the call for integrity in leadership is louder than ever, but so is the danger of losing that very ideal. Raila Odinga's death is not just a national loss, it's a continental warning. A reminder that democracy can fade not through tyranny, but through forgetting, through the slow erosion of memory when citizens trade courage for convenience and leaders trade conviction for comfort. But amid this grief, a new generation is awakening. Young Africans who have studied Odinga's resilience, who have seen Ibrahim Traoré stand tall against the pressures of empire, who now believe that sovereignty is not a slogan, it's survival. Traoré himself once said, "A man who fears the truth will never serve his people." And in those words, the old and the new converge. Odinga's spirit does not die, it transforms. From the courtrooms of Nairobi to the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, his fight continues in new faces, new voices, and new revolutions. Perhaps that is the real legacy, not the funeral, not the speeches, but the inheritance of courage. Because in every generation, someone must choose to stand alone until the world catches up. So tonight, as we remember Raila Amolo Odinga, the father, the fighter, the statesman, let us ask ourselves, do we still believe in the kind of truth he lived for? Do we still have the strength to build nations, not just governments? If you believe his legacy belongs to all of us, share this story. If you believe that Africa's light still burns through men like Ibrahim Traoré, subscribe and stand with us. Because heroes may die, but history never ends. And in the echo of Odinga's silence, a continent is listening again.